The stairs have 7 steps. I have counted them from the bottom more times than I have counted anything in my life. More than the books I shelved at the Briarfield Public Library. More than the children I read to on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. More than the milligrams of clonazepam I swallowed in the parking lot before walking into a grocery store, which is something I did for 11 years and never told anyone except Dr. Keene, who prescribed them, and my mother, who pretended not to hear. 7 steps. Poured concrete, 22 inches wide, with a slight leftward camber where the original contractor didn't level the form. The 4th step has a hairline crack I could trace with my eyes closed. The 7th step ends at a steel hatch with a wheel lock that I oiled every 6 weeks with a rag and a can of 3-in-1 I found under the generator shelf. I am not a survivalist. I am not a prepper. I didn't build this bunker, and I didn't buy it. I entered it on March 3rd, the year the world ended, which was also 11 days before the world ended. And I entered it because Dr. Keene's colleague, a behavioral psychologist named Dr. Ellison Fry, believed that my agoraphobia had become so structurally embedded that the only way to rebuild my tolerance for open spaces was to remove them entirely and then reintroduce them in controlled increments. Graduated exposure therapy, underground edition. That was the idea. The bunker belonged to a man named Harlan Doss, a retired civil engineer from Tulsa who had converted an old Forest Service utility vault on 80 acres of his land in the Ouachita National Forest into a functioning underground residence. 2 rooms, a composting toilet, a rainwater collection system fed by surface pipes, a propane generator, a solar battery bank, and enough stored food for 14 months. Harlan had advertised it through a network. Dr. Fry found online wilderness therapy retreats for anxiety disorders, PTSD, sensory processing issues. The website had a photo of Harlan standing beside the hatch with a golden retriever and the words, "Stillness is not hiding." I remember thinking that was exactly the kind of thing a person says when they have never been afraid of a parking lot. I paid $4,000 for a 12-week stay. My mother drove me to the property. Harlan showed me how the water filter worked, how to reset the generator, how to check the solar bank levels. He gave me a binder. He gave me a satellite phone with his number and Dr. Fry's. He said the nearest town was Mena, Arkansas, 19 miles southeast, and that he'd check on me every 10 days. My mother cried in the truck. I didn't. I walked down the 7 steps, closed the hatch, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt the muscles between my shoulder blades release. The ceiling was 9 feet above me. The walls were 11 feet apart. The air tasted like concrete dust and propane residue and absolute safety. That was March 3rd. Harlan came on March 13th. He knocked on the hatch 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, which was the signal we'd agreed on. He brought fresh batteries, a newspaper, and a bag of oranges. He said the news was strange. He said there was something in Memphis. I didn't read the newspaper. I was 3 chapters into rereading The Phantom Toll Booth from memory because I had read it to children 140 times and could reconstruct it nearly word for word. This had become my project, rebuilding the books I knew by heart onto notebook paper. A library inside a bunker inside a forest. It made me feel less like a patient and more like an archivist. Harlan was supposed to come back on March 23rd. He didn't. On March 14th, the satellite phone picked up an emergency alert system broadcast. I didn't hear it in real time. The phone stored it as a text-based message, and I read it the way you read a weather advisory scanning for relevance, finding none. The word outbreak appeared 3 times. The word Memphis appeared twice. The phrase "shelter in place" appeared once. None of these words landed with weight because I was already sheltering. I was already in place. The instruction described my default condition. On March 15th, a second alert arrived. This one used the word lethal. It said the governor of Arkansas had activated the National Guard. It said to avoid contact with any individual displaying signs of cranial hemorrhaging, erratic motor function, or unresponsive verbal affect. I read it twice. I put the phone down. I went back to reconstructing Chapter 4 of The Phantom Toll Booth, the one where Milo drives into the doldrums, and the Lethargerians try to make him do nothing forever. The irony did not escape me, but it also did not move me. On March 17th, the alert stopped. Not gradually. The phone simply ceased receiving. I pressed the buttons. I checked the antenna connection through the surface conduit port. Nothing. I tried Harlan's number. A tone I had never heard, not busy, not disconnected, but a single flat note that held for exactly 4 seconds and then silence. I tried my mother's number. Same tone. I sat on the edge of the cot and held the phone against my sternum, like a compress, and felt something I want to describe honestly. I felt afraid, but I also felt relieved. And the relief was larger. And I have carried the shame of that ever since. Because here is the truth about agoraphobia that I never successfully explain to anyone who doesn't have it. It is not the fear of open spaces. It is the fear of being caught in a situation you cannot escape. A mall, a highway, a conversation, a crowd, a normal Tuesday. And the only thing that relieves it is the certainty that you don't have to go. Not that you won't, that you don't have to. The obligation itself is the blade. Remove the obligation, and the panic drains like water from a tub. When the phone died, every obligation died with it. No check-in calls with Dr. Fry. No scheduled exposure exercises. Day 14. Open the hatch for 5 minutes. Day 21. Stand outside for 10. No mother waiting for progress reports. No Harlan arriving with oranges and expectations. The entire scaffolding of my reintroduction to the surface world collapsed in a single flat tone. And what rushed into the gap was the purest, most shameful peace I had ever felt. The world was ending. I was finally comfortable. I ate my dinner, canned minestrone, a sleeve of crackers, a multivitamin, and slept for 9 hours without dreaming. On March 20th, I heard the first sound. Something was moving through the brush above the hatch. Not animal movement. I'd already learned the difference. Deer are rhythmic. Raccoons are investigatory. Lots of pauses and scratchings. This was continuous. A drag. A stuttered, heavy pull through dry leaves with no pause and no variation, as if someone were hauling a piece of furniture across the forest floor. It lasted 40 seconds. Then it stopped directly above me. I could feel the weight through the ceiling, not hear it. Feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you in a quiet room. I turned off the lamp. I held my breath. I waited. 3 minutes later, the dragging resumed and moved east, away from the hatch, until it faded into the ordinary sounds of the forest. I did not go up the stairs. I did not open the hatch. I sat in the dark and felt my heart rate settle and thought, this is where I belong, below everything, where nothing can reach me. That was the first night of the first year. I need to explain the bunker because the bunker became me. 2 rooms. The main chamber was roughly 12 by 14 feet with poured concrete walls, a sealed concrete floor, and a corrugated steel ceiling braced by 2 I-beams. Harlan had insulated the walls with rigid foam behind plywood paneling and laid commercial carpet tiles over the floor. The room held a cot, a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, a bookshelf with 11 paperbacks I'd brought and 6 Harlan had left, a camp stove connected to a 20-pound propane tank, and a battery-powered radio that received nothing after March 17th, but that I kept on the shelf anyway because its shape was familiar. The second room was smaller, 8 by 8, and held the composting toilet, a utility sink fed by the rainwater system, the solar battery bank, the propane generator, and the storage shelves. Harlan had stocked those shelves with military surplus MREs. Canned goods, rice, dried beans, powdered milk, coffee, sugar, salt, a medical kit, and 2 cases of bottled water as backup. The binder he left me included an inventory sheet. 14 months of food for one person at 1,800 calories per day. That number became my calendar. By the end of the first month, I had reorganized every shelf, labeled every can, counted every MRE, and established a rotation system that would stretch 14 months to 20 if I dropped to 1,400 calories. I was already thin. I had always been thin. My mother called it forgetting to eat, which was her way of not calling it what Dr. Keene sometimes called it, which was a conversation I am not going to have here. The air system was passive. A 4-inch ventilation pipe ran from the ceiling through 12 feet of soil to a screened surface cap hidden in a rock formation 20 yards from the hatch. The cap was designed to be invisible from ground level. Air flowed in. Stale air vented through a second pipe on the opposite side of the ceiling. It worked. The air always tasted like dirt and distance, which I came to love. By the end of the second month, I had reconstructed the phantom toll booth, Charlotte's Web, where the wild things are, the giving tree, and the first 4 chapters of A Wrinkle in Time, from memory onto notebook paper. My handwriting, which had always been careful a librarian's handwriting, ruled and legible, became smaller as I rationed pages. I wrote with a mechanical pencil. I had 8 leads. Each lead lasted approximately 40 pages. I calculated that I had enough lead for 320 pages, which was enough for perhaps 6 complete children's books if I kept the margins tight. This was my work. This was what I did instead of going up the stairs. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the difference between what I was doing and what a sane person would have been doing. A sane person would have been monitoring the radio, rationing with the intent to survive long enough to leave, planning a surface expedition. A sane person would have climbed the 7 stairs, opened the hatch, and looked. I did not look. Not in month 1, not in month 3, not in month 6. I heard things the dragging returned irregularly, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, sometimes with a vocalization that sounded like air escaping a tire, slowly and never quite finishing. I cataloged these sounds the way I cataloged books, by frequency, by duration, by proximity. I kept a notebook I labeled Surface Sounds and logged every entry with a date and a time. I was being a librarian of my own fear, and the collection was growing, and I never once opened the cover. Somewhere around month 8, I started the murals. I had found, in Harlan's utility supplies, 4 cans of exterior latex paint, white, green, brown, and a blue so pale it was almost gray. He must have used them for the surface structures. I had no brushes, but I had rags, and I had fingers, and I had 22 hours a day with nothing to do except not go upstairs. The first mural was the Briarfield Public Library reading room. I painted it on the south wall of the main chamber, life-size, from memory. The arched windows with their rippled glass, the oak tables with the brass reading lamps, the carpet which was dark red with a pattern of interlocking diamonds that I had stared at for 14 years while sitting on the floor with children who believed that a woman who couldn't walk into a Target without medication was the bravest person they knew because she did all the voices. I did all the voices. Every book, where the wild things are. I roared the terrible roars and gnashed the terrible teeth, and the children roared back, and it was the only room in the world where I wasn't sick. I painted that room onto the concrete, and I stood inside both rooms at once. And I didn't cry, because I'd stopped crying in month 5. Not from strength, but from a drought I couldn't explain. By the end of year 1, the south wall was the library. The east wall became the forest above me, or what I imagined it looked like, since I hadn't seen it since March 3rd. I painted oaks and short-leaf pines and a canopy that filtered light into coins on the ground. The blue paint became sky through the branches. The brown paint became trunks and earth, and the path Harlan had walked me down on that first day. The west wall, I left blank. I told myself I was saving it. In truth, I was afraid of what I would paint there. The west wall faced the stairs. Meanwhile, the bunker was changing in ways that weren't aesthetic. In month 4, I had discovered that the rainwater collection pipe, which ran along the ceiling and through a sediment filter before reaching the sink, had enough pressure to support a small diversion. I spent 3 weeks using a multi-tool and a length of surgical tubing from the medical kit, rigging a secondary line that fed a shallow plastic bin I placed under the grow light Harlan had left, for I never figured out what he'd intended it for. Maybe herbs, maybe therapy. It didn't matter. I filled the bin with soil I scraped from the ventilation pipe's interior condensation trap, mixed with composted waste from the toilet system, and planted 3 dried beans from the food supply. They grew. In a concrete box underground, in recycled light and stolen soil, they grew. And when the first leaf uncurled, I spoke out loud for the first time in weeks. I said, "Well, look at you." And then I said it again, in the voice I used for the very hungry caterpillar, the one where everything is wonder. And the sound of that voice in that room broke something in me that I then carefully put back together and did not examine. By the end of year 2, I had a functional garden. 7 bins, beans, lentils, a scraggly tomato plant that never fruited but stayed alive out of what I can only describe as spite, and an herb I couldn't identify that had arrived as a seed in the soil and that I allowed to live because it was a volunteer and I respected the audacity. The food supply recalculated. I was now at 32 months and counting. The beans supplemented the stored protein. The lentils were modest but real. I was surviving indefinitely, and the word indefinitely was starting to taste the way the air tasted, like concrete and distance, and something I might once have called peace if I hadn't known better. I should tell you about the sounds, because the sounds were my only proof that the world still existed above me and that the things in it had not gone away. Year 1 sounds. The dragging, which I logged 142 times. Vocalizations, which I logged 67 times, always that slow, pressurized exhalation. Never a scream, never a word. Impact sounds against the hatch, which I logged 11 times, and which were the only entries that made my hands shake while writing. Silence, which I did not log, because silence was the default, and you don't catalog the ocean from inside it. Year 2 sounds shifted. The dragging decreased. 89 entries. The vocalizations changed timbre, became wetter, more guttural, as if whatever produced them was deteriorating. I recorded this observation with clinical distance, because clinical distance was the only distance I had. But new sounds arrived. In month 14, I heard what I was almost certain was a bird. A single sharp call, repeated 3 times, and then gone. I pressed my ear to the ventilation pipe and held my breath for 4 minutes and heard nothing more. But I wrote in the log, bird, confirmed. 3 calls, eastern direction, and I underlined it twice. In month 19, rain. I had heard rain before. Obviously, the collection system depended on it. But this rain was different. It was a thunderstorm. And through the pipe and the concrete and the soil, I heard it as a deep, rolling vibration that filled the room like a held cord. I lay on the cot and pressed my palms flat against the wall and listened to the sky doing something enormous directly above me and felt a pull so strong it scared me. Not a pull upward. That's what a normal person would feel. A pull further in. A desire to crawl into the wall, to become the concrete, to be so deep that even the rain couldn't remind me there was a surface. That is what agoraphobia sounds like from the inside. The world reaches for you, and you flinch deeper into the crack. I started sleeping against the wall after that. Not on the cot. On the floor, spine pressed against the east mural, the painted forest with a blanket wrapped tight, and my face turned toward the painted trees. Some mornings I woke with paint on my cheek, and for a half-second believed I had been outside. Year 3. The sounds above changed again, and this time the change was the thing I should have paid attention to and didn't. The dragging dropped to 31 entries for the entire year. The vocalizations dropped to 9. The impacts on the hatch, 0. And the new sounds, bird song, insect noise, wind through canopy without the dragging undertone, increased until, by the end of year 3, the surface sounded almost exactly like a forest that had nothing wrong with it. I wrote this down. I drew a graph. I made a chart of frequency over time, because I was a librarian, and librarians organize information. And organizing information is not the same as acting on it. The chart clearly showed a declining threat curve. Any rational person would have looked at that chart and said, "It's getting safer, go up." I looked at the chart and thought, the garden needs repotting. The radio came back to life on a Tuesday in the 3rd year. I know it was a Tuesday because I had maintained a calendar from day 1, scratched into the wall beside the cot with a nail. And I trusted it within a margin of plus or minus 2 days, which meant it was either a Tuesday, a Monday, or a Wednesday. But I chose Tuesday because Tuesday was when I used to read to the children, and I wanted this to mean something. Static first, then a voice. Male, middle-aged, unhurried, reading what sounded like a supply list. 14 cases purified, 6 propane standard, 200 amoxicillin, requested not confirmed. Relay south to Pine Bluff Hub by 0800 Friday. I sat on the floor with the radio in my lap and listened to a man talk about antibiotics and propane for 6 minutes before the signal dissolved into hiss. I did not respond. The radio was receive only. But even if it hadn't been, even if I could have pressed a button and spoken, I don't know that I would have, because here is the thing I have to say. The thing that is the center of this entire account. I didn't want to be found. Not then. Not in year 3. The bunker was no longer my treatment facility or my shelter. It was my home in the purest sense, the first place I had ever lived, where the walls matched my interior architecture. Small, sealed, complete. The library mural on the south wall, the forest on the east, the garden under the grow light, the books I had written from memory in careful, shrinking handwriting. I had built, over 3 years, the only world that had ever fit me, and the radio was a crack in the ceiling that threatened to let in the sky. The broadcasts continued, irregularly at first, twice a week, then daily. The voice was sometimes the supply man, sometimes a woman who read community announcements with the cadence of a school principal. I learned, through fragments, that organized settlements existed, that the military had consolidated into regional hubs, that the infected, they used the word remnants, were declining in number but still present in forested and rural areas. That Pine Bluff, Arkansas, was a functioning community of approximately 1,200 people, that they were looking for survivors. They were looking for me. Not me specifically, but me categorically. Anyone still out there, alone, hiding, waiting. I turned the volume down, not off, down. Low enough that the voices became a murmur I could hear from the cot if I concentrated, but not so loud that they filled the room and replaced the silence I'd come to need. Month by month, the broadcasts painted a world that was damaged but rebuilding, a world with supply chains and medical clinics, and once a mention of a school being reopened in Fort Smith. A school with children. Who would need someone to read to them? I heard that and walked to the stairs and stood at the bottom and looked up at the hatch and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 steps, 12 feet of vertical distance. The hand wheel would need 2 full rotations counterclockwise. I knew these numbers the way I knew my own body. I stood there for 20 minutes. Then I went back to the garden and repotted the lentils and didn't go upstairs. This happened 14 times over the next 5 months. I counted those too. Year 4 was the year I stopped pretending I was waiting for the surface to become safe enough, and admitted I was making the bunker too beautiful to leave. I built a shelf from scrap plywood and stacked it with the notebooks, 31 of them now, filled with reconstructed children's books, sound logs, garden records, and something I'd started in year 2 that I called the Branch Library Collection. This was my attempt to rebuild, entirely from memory, every book I had ever read to the Tuesday-Thursday children at Briarfield. Not summaries. The full text, as close as I could reconstruct, word by word, page by page, with illustrations drawn in the margins with my shrinking pencil leads. I was on my 43rd book, James and the Giant Peach. I could see the cover in my mind, the orange gold peach. James's small figure, and I could hear my own voice reading the opening line about the rhinoceros. And I wrote it down in letters so small that a magnifying glass would have helped. And I understood that I was performing an act that looked like preservation, but was actually burial. I was interring these books in concrete so that they would have a reason to stay here with me. The ventilation pipe became my periscope. Not literally, I couldn't see through it. But sound travels in both directions, through a 4-inch pipe. And by year 4, I had learned to read the surface through acoustic cues with a precision that bordered on professional. I could tell season by insect density. I could estimate time of day by bird activity. I could detect rain 20 minutes before it reached the collection system by the change in air pressure through the pipe. And I could tell that the remnants were nearly gone. The dragging sounds, which had defined year 1, appeared only 4 times in all of year 4. Each time, the movement was slower, more erratic, with longer pauses. Whatever was left up there was winding down. The forest was reclaiming itself. Through the pipe, I could hear what healthy woodland sounds like, layered, rhythmic, alive, without being threatening. And it sounded like a place a person could walk through. And that knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. I swallowed daily and pretended was nutrition. The radio told the same story in human language. Pine Bluff had grown to 1,800. Fort Smith had electricity. A woman read a segment once a week about agricultural planning that assumed a future measured in years not days. They had stopped saying if we survive and started saying next season. The grammar of continuation. The syntax of a world that had moved on. And I was still underground, painting a tree on a concrete wall instead of standing under a real one. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what I was doing. I knew. I had always known. Dr. Keene told me once that agoraphobia is not a fear of spaces, but a fear of the self in spaces, the terror that you will come apart in the open, that the thing holding you together requires walls, and that removing the walls removes you. He was describing a prison and calling it a diagnosis. He was right about both. The bunker held me together. It had held me together for 4 years. And every improvement I made, every mural, every garden bin, every reconstructed book, was another bar in a cage I was building from the inside. And the cage was gorgeous. And I was the most functional I had ever been in my life. And I was disappearing. I painted the west wall in the middle of year 4. I had avoided it for 3.5 years. It faced the stairs. It faced the direction of out. I told myself the blank concrete was a design choice negative space, a rest for the eye. But blank walls in a library are unfinished business, and I was a librarian, and I couldn't leave it any longer. I painted my mother, not her face. I couldn't hold her face still in my memory long enough. It kept shifting between ages, between expressions, between the mother who drove me here and the mother who answered the phone too quickly every time I called, which told me she'd been holding it. I painted her hands on the steering wheel of the truck the day she brought me, her hands pressing a crease out of my shirt collar at the top of the stairs before I went down. Her hands were specific and permanent in my memory, in a way her face had become weathered by time and distance, and the particular cruelty of underground lighting, which flattens everything into the same pale plane. I painted her hands life-size on the west wall, at approximately the height they would be if she were standing in front of me. And when I finished, I stood at the base of the stairs and looked at them. And they were reaching toward me from the direction of the hatch. And I understood what I had done, and I did not undo it. That was also the month I ran out of pencil lead. I want you to understand what that meant. Not the practical inconvenience. I had pens. I had the paint. I could have scratched letters with a nail. The pencil lead was the last connection to the method. A library pencil, mechanical, 0.5 millimeters. The same type I used at the circulation desk to note returns. When the last lead broke inside the barrel, I held the empty pencil for a long time and thought about the phrase, out of lead, and how it sounded like something else. I started writing with a sharpened stick dipped in paint water. The letters were larger, cruder, harder to control. My 44th book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, looked like it had been written by a different person. Someone less precise. Someone whose hands were forgetting the discipline of small, careful marks. I was losing my fine motor control. Not dramatically, I could still open cans, still manage the garden, still oil the hatch wheel I never turned. But the delicacy was going. 4 years without varied physical activity, without reaching for high shelves or turning doorknobs or handing a picture book across a table to a 4-year-old. My body was adapting to the bunker the way the bunker had adapted to me settling into the smallest possible range of motion, becoming efficient for this space and useless for any other. I did hand exercises after that. Every morning, stretching, gripping, extending. I told myself it was about the writing. It was about the writing. It was also about a door I might need to open someday that would require 2 full counterclockwise rotations and more grip strength than painting and gardening could maintain. I did the exercises facing the west wall, facing my mother's hands, They reached for me every morning, while I practiced reaching for nothing. Early in year 5, I heard a footstep. Not a drag, not the stuttered, continuous pull of a remnant. A footstep. Deliberate, weighted, with the specific rhythm of a biped who was choosing where to place each foot. A human cadence, a hiker's cadence. Someone walking through the brush above me with intention and balance. And I heard it through the ventilation pipe as clearly as I had ever heard anything in my life. I stood beneath the pipe and pressed my ear to the opening and listened to a person walk within 30 feet of my hatch and continue east without stopping. My heart rate, which I had learned to monitor by counting pulse beats against my calendar marks, hit what I estimated was 140. Not from fear, from something worse. From the collision of two facts I had kept in separate rooms inside my head. The surface was survivable, and I was choosing not to survive on it. A person. A living, walking, intentional person. Close enough that if I had opened the hatch and called out, they would have heard me. Close enough that my voice, which I used only for reading aloud to no one, could have reached another human being for the first time in almost 5 years. I didn't open the hatch. I didn't call out. I pressed my hand flat against the concrete ceiling and felt the faintest vibration of their footsteps fading, and I thought, come back, don't come back, come back, don't come back. An alternating current with no resolution, pulsing through my palm into the earth and disappearing. They didn't come back, not that day. But 4 days later, I heard footsteps again. 2 sets this time. And voices, muffled, indistinct through 12 feet of soil, but voices conversation, the give-and-take rhythm of people who knew each other, who were walking together, who existed in a social contract I had exited so long ago that the sound of casual dialogue was as alien to me as the dragging had been in year 1. They were surveying. I figured this out over the following weeks, as the footsteps became regular every 3 to 4 days, always in pairs, always moving through the same corridor of forest. The radio broadcasts had mentioned resource mapping teams, people cataloging timber, water sources, usable structures in the recovery zones. They were mapping my forest, which meant they would find the hatch. The hatch was concealed. Harlan had built a hinged cover of local stone over it that looked from above like a natural rock formation. But a survey team moves slowly. They measure. They look closely at terrain features. And the rainwater collection pipes, while buried, terminated at surface-level catchment basins that a careful eye would eventually notice. I had at most a few weeks before someone found me. I sat at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the hatch and felt the most complicated emotion of my life. Not fear, not relief. Something that contained both and also contained grief. And also contained a rage so specific it had an address. I was furious at the world for recovering. I was furious that the emergency that had given me permission to be exactly who I had always been, a person who stayed inside, was ending. And with it, the only excuse I had ever had that didn't require a diagnosis code. The outbreak had been my permission slip, and it was expiring. I heard her before I understood her. A voice through the ventilation pipe, not the distant murmur of passing surveyors. Close, directly above the pipe cap. A child's voice, and she was singing. Not a song I recognized. Melody without fixed lyrics, improvised, wandering, the kind of song a child invents while doing something repetitive. Skipping, stacking rocks, waiting for someone to finish a task that doesn't involve her. The melody looped and varied and looped again. And I stood beneath the pipe with my hands at my sides and my mouth open and listened to a child sing to herself for the first time, in 5 years. the world went liquid. Everything I had built, the murals, the garden, the careful numbering of days, the reconstructed library, the entire architecture of my underground life, softened at the edges and wobbled. And at the center of the wobble was this. I knew that voice. Not that voice. Not that specific child. But the type of voice. The unself-conscious, half-pitched, breathy singing of a child between 5 and 7 who doesn't know anyone is listening. I had heard it 1,000 times in the reading room. I had built my entire professional life around being in the presence of that sound. She came back the next day, and the next. Always near the pipe cap, always singing or talking, sometimes to herself, sometimes to someone I couldn't hear. On the 4th day, she talked to what I realized was an imaginary companion, narrating a complex scenario involving a bear who ran a hospital. The bear's name was Dr. Paws. Dr. Paws had to decide whether to give the last medicine to the rabbit or the fox. And the child played both parts. And the rabbit said, "But I've been waiting longer." And the fox said, "But I'm sicker." And the child, as Dr. Paws said, "Then we make more," which is the kind of solution only a child offers, and only a child believes. And it is the correct answer to every impossible question. I sank to the floor and pressed my back against the wall, and pulled my knees up and held them, and understood that this was the thing that was going to break the bunker open. Not the declining threat, not the radio broadcasts, not the survey teams. A child playing above me, close enough to hear, too far to reach without climbing 7 stairs and opening a door I had sealed for 5 years. On the 6th day, the child found the pipe. I heard the singing get closer, and then a tapping, small, curious, investigatory, against the metal cap. A pause. Then her voice, amplified by the pipe into sudden, shocking clarity, as if she were in the room with me. "Hello? Is there a cave down here?" I pressed both hands over my mouth. "Hello? I can hear air going in. Are you a cave? Caves have bats." I did not answer. I stood in my bunker with my hands clamped over my face and my eyes burning and my entire body vibrating with the effort of not answering a child who was asking if I was a cave. She tapped the pipe again. "If you're a bat, you can come out. I won't scare you." Then footsteps, adult, quick, and a woman's voice. "B, get away from there. Don't touch things you don't recognize." "But it's a cave, Mom. There's air." "It's a vent pipe. Come on, Dad's waiting." Footsteps receding. The melody resuming, further away, fading. I stood there, for what the nail marks on my wall would later tell me was 3 hours. I stood in the exact spot, and did not move, and did not sit, and did not go to the garden or the mural or the notebook. I stood and pressed my hands against the pipe and waited for her to come back, and she didn't. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing the bunker had ever contained. B came back. Not the next day. 4 days later. I had spent those 4 days in a state I can only compare to withdrawal. Shaky, unfocused, unable to read or write or tend the garden. I left the grow light off for 2 days, and 3 lentil seedlings died, and I didn't care. The murals looked like what they were, paint on concrete. The notebooks looked like what they were, a woman talking to herself in shrinking handwriting about books she once read to people who had forgotten her. She came back on what I calculated was a Thursday, and this time she came straight to the pipe and said without preamble, "I know you're there. I can hear you breathing when it's quiet." She could hear me. Through the pipe, my breath, my presence, the simple fact of my respiration carried up through 4 inches of metal and 12 feet of soil. and entered the open air as evidence that something alive was below. "Are you a person or an animal?" she asked. "You can tap once for person and 2 for animal." I stood beneath the pipe and looked at my hands and made a decision I did not make with my brain. My knuckle rose and struck the pipe once. The sound rang through the bunker like a bell. Silence. Then, I knew it. "Are you okay?" Tap once for yes. 1 tap. "Are you stuck?" Tap once for stuck, 2 for not stuck. I hesitated. Then I tapped twice. Most honest and most dishonest thing I had ever communicated. "If you're not stuck, how come you don't come out?" No tapping code for that. No single knock that translates, "Because I'm more afraid of your sky than I ever was of the things that used to drag themselves across the ground above me." My name is B. I'm 6 3/4. We live at the camp. It's got tents and a real kitchen. And Marcus fixed the water so it comes out of a pipe like at a house. "What's your name?" I hadn't spoken to another person in 5 years. My vocal cords had maintained basic function through the reading aloud practice. But conversation, the responsive, alive exchange of language shaped by another person's input, was a skill that had atrophied beyond anything the hand exercises had addressed. I opened my mouth. I shaped the first letter. No sound came. I tried again. What came out was less a voice than a vibration given reluctant permission to escape. June. It traveled up the pipe. B received it as naturally as if I'd set it across a table. "Hi, June. Do you like stories?" And I laughed. The sound was so unfamiliar it startled me, like a piece of furniture falling in an empty room. But it was laughter, and it went up the pipe, and B said, "Is that a yes?" And I said yes. And she said, "Okay, I'll tell you one." And she told me a story about Dr. Paws performing surgery on a butterfly's wing using a leaf and some very special tape. And I sat on the floor with my head tilted back, and the pipe carrying her voice to me like a thread lowered into a well. And I held on. B came every day after that. She came in the morning, she said, because afternoons were for lessons and evenings were for helping her mom with the growing stuff, which I understood to be a garden, which meant there was a garden above me and a garden below me and a 6-year-old connecting them. We developed a language, taps for yes and no. My voice for short answers, her voice for everything else. She told me about the camp 14 families, she said, using her fingers to count in a way I could hear through the cadence of her pauses. They had been there for about a year, relocated from Pine Bluff when the expansion team started clearing forest zones for timber and agriculture. Her father was a surveyor. Her mother was in charge of the seeds. Marcus, who she mentioned often, was apparently in charge of everything mechanical. She told me there were 2 other children, a boy named Kai, who was 8, and a baby everyone called Bug, whose real name was something she couldn't pronounce. She told me Kai was okay but bossy, and Bug didn't do anything interesting yet. She asked me questions I answered in as few words as possible, not from reluctance, but from the rust on my language. Why was I underground? I was here before everything happened. Was I alone? Yes. Did I have food? Some. Did I have books? And here I paused and then said, I have the ones I remembered. What does that mean? I used to read to children at a library. I wrote the books down from memory. Silence. A long, thoughtful, 6 3/4-year-old silence. Then, can you read one to me? I retrieved the notebook with Where the Wild Things Are. I sat beneath the pipe. I opened to the first page and read, The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another. I don't know this one, B said. Keep going. I read the entire book into a ventilation pipe to a child sitting on the ground above me in a forest that had survived the end of the world. My voice cracked twice. I did all the voices. When I reached, and it was still hot, B said, "Read it again." And I did. On the 5th day of our reading sessions, B said, "June, my mom wants to talk to you." A different voice at the pipe. Older, careful, carrying the specific wariness of a parent assessing an unknown adult's interaction with her child. "Hello? This is Annika, B's mother." "Hello? She says you've been down there since before the outbreak." "Yes." "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you? Is there a reason you can't come up?" The question that contained the entire 5 years and every step I hadn't climbed, and every morning I had faced the west wall with my mother's painted hands reaching for me, and turned away and gone back to the garden. "I have agoraphobia," I said. "It's a panic disorder. I'm afraid of open spaces." A pause. Then, with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that what she is about to say will not fix anything but must be said. "June, there's a community up here. We have a medical tent. We have people who might be able to help." "I know." "B talks about you constantly. She told Marcus you have a library. He wants to know if you have agricultural manuals." "I have a garden." Another pause. "You have a garden. Underground. Beans, lentils, an herb I can't identify." I heard Annika exhale, not a sigh, but the sound of someone recalculating. "Would you be willing to let someone come down? Not to make you leave. Just to meet you? B's father. His name is Thomas. He's calm." "No." I said it before the panic hit, which is how I knew it was true. The bunker was mine. The space was calibrated to my body, my breath, my solitary presence. Another person inside it would displace something I couldn't name, but couldn't survive without. "Okay," Annika said. "Okay. Then we talk through the pipe. That's fine. You tell me what you need." "I don't need anything." "June, everyone needs something." I looked at the notebooks. I looked at the murals. I looked at the garden under the grow light. I need someone to read to. Annika was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've got one." B brought Kai on the 8th day. He was skeptical and direct, the way 8-year-olds are when they suspect an adult is performing something they haven't agreed to be an audience for. "B says you live in the ground like a mole person," he said into the pipe. "That's approximately correct." "Why?" "Because I was here when everything happened, and I stayed." "That's dumb." "Kai, B." "It is. Everything's fine now. Mom says the remnants are basically all gone. Marcus hasn't seen one in like a year." "I know." "So why don't you come out?" "Because knowing something is safe and feeling safe are different." He processed this. "Like how I know the river's not deep, but I still don't want to put my head under?" "Yes, like that." "Oh." A different silence. Softer. "Okay. B says you do voices." I read them, James and the Giant Peach. Kai interrupted, constantly clarifying plot points, objecting to character decisions, demanding that I reread the centipede's dialogue with more attitude. B shushed him. He ignored her. They argued through the pipe about whether the earthworm was brave or just confused. And their argument echoed in the bunker, and the walls absorbed their voices. And for the first time in 5 years, the room felt too small. Not in the safe way, not in the held way, in the way where you realize you are standing in a space built for maintenance equipment, and you have been pretending it is a life. It happened over weeks. Not a single dramatic rupture, but a series of hairline fractures, spreading through the structure I had built. Each one originating from the pipe, each one carried by a voice. B brought me problems, interpersonal disputes with Kai, questions about plants, a request to explain what the ocean looked like because she had never seen it, and Kai says it's just a big lake, but I don't believe him. Kai brought me practical challenges. Could I explain how my water filtration worked, so Marcus could compare it to theirs? Did I know why some bean varieties grew better in low light? Annika brought me adult conversation, carefully rationed, never pushing toward the hatch, but never pretending the hatch wasn't there. And Thomas the surveyor, the father, the man whose footsteps I had first heard in year 5, brought me a map. He slid it down the ventilation pipe rolled into a tight cylinder. It took 40 minutes of coaxing with a bent wire to extract it from the narrow tube. When I unrolled it on the table, it was a hand-drawn topographical survey of the surrounding 2-mile radius. Every trail, every water feature, every structure, every cleared zone. And at the center, marked with a small square and the word June, was my bunker. I was on the map. I was a known location, a named point in a human geography that extended in every direction toward people and structures and a world that had continued without me and was now, through a 4-inch pipe, reaching down. I pinned the map to the west wall next to my mother's painted hands. The 2 images touched. My mother's reaching fingers and the surveyor's ink lines and the word June in someone else's handwriting. The wall that faced the stairs. The wall I'd avoided for 3.5 years. It was now the most crowded surface in the bunker. On the first day of the 6th year, B asked me to come to her birthday. She was turning 7. "We're having cake," she said. "Marcus figured out how to make an oven from a truck part. It's going to be a real cake. You have to come." "B, it's outside, but you could just sit by the hatch. You don't have to go far. I'll come get you. I'll hold your hand." I stood beneath the pipe and pressed my forehead against the concrete ceiling and felt the weight of 6 years of safety and 6 years of absence settle onto the same point in my chest. "When is it?" I asked. "Saturday morning. Mom says the light is nice in the morning." The light is nice in the morning. An observation so ordinary, it could only come from someone who had never lost access to morning light, and therefore understood its value precisely as much as it deserved, which is to say, enough to mention and not enough to worship. "I'll try," I said. "Trying is just doing it scared," B said. "That's what Mom says." Saturday. I woke in the dark at what my internal clock said was early, maybe 5 a.m. I lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about the stairs. 7 steps. I could see them from the cot. The bunker was small enough that I could see everything from everywhere, which had been the comfort and was now the cage. The lamp was off. The only light came from the grow light over the garden, a pale violet glow that turned the room into something that looked, from the cot, like a cave seen from very far away. I got up. I ate a handful of lentils from yesterday's harvest. I drank water from the filter. I stood in front of the west wall and looked at my mother's hands and the map. And the word June, and I thought, Dr. Keene would tell me to identify the fear. The fear is not the sky. The fear is not the open space. The fear is that I will come apart, that whatever holds me together requires these walls, and that removing the walls removes me. I thought, but a child is turning 7, and she invited me, and I said I would try. And trying is just doing it scared. I walked to the stairs. Step 1, concrete, 22 inches wide, solid underfoot. My legs knew this step. I had stood on it 14 times in year 3 alone, and then retreated. Step 2. The crack in step 4 was visible from here. A hairline, Nothing structural. I had traced it with my fingers so many times I could find it in total darkness. Step 3. My breathing changed. Not hyperventilation, a tightening, a shallow constriction. The body's way of saying, we are approaching the perimeter. I had felt this in grocery store parking lots, in mall corridors, in the Briarfield Public Library parking lot, before I found the side entrance that let me slip in without crossing the main lot. My body's perimeter alarm. And it was ringing now in a place where the perimeter was 7 steps instead of 700 feet. Step 4. The crack under my right foot. Familiar, specific, mine. I pressed my weight into it. I breathed. I looked up. The hatch was 3 steps away. Steel, painted gray, with a hand wheel I had oiled every 6 weeks for 6 years. The wheel was slightly left of center. The handle was at approximately 2 o'clock position. 2 full rotations, counterclockwise. Step 5. I could smell the difference. The air from above, drawn through the pipe and through the soil, was always present. But here, 3 steps from the hatch, it was stronger, organic, complex. Not the controlled simplicity of concrete and propane residue, but the layered, shifting, living scent of a forest in morning. Dew, bark, soil that was being touched by actual sunlight. Step 6. My hand on the wall, my pulse visible in my wrist. The panic at full bloom, now not the electric, screaming panic of an acute attack, but the deep, tidal, foundational panic of someone approaching the exact boundary of their known self. The place where June in the bunker ends and June outside begins. And the terror that June outside might not exist anymore. That 6 years underground might have dissolved her entirely, leaving only a function, a reader, a gardener, an archivist with no body capable of surviving open sky. Step 7. I reached for the wheel. 2 full rotations counterclockwise. My grip strength, maintained by 4 years of morning exercises in front of my mother's painted hands, was sufficient. The mechanism turned. The seal broke with a sound like an exhale, the bunker breathing out for the first time in 6 years. And a blade of light appeared at the edge of the hatch, so bright and so white that I flinched and nearly fell backward. I pushed the hatch open. The sky hit me like water. Not figuratively, the sheer volume of uncontained space above me produced a physical sensation of immersion, of drowning upward. And I gripped the hatch rim with both hands and held on, and did not close my eyes, because Bee had said she would come and get me, and I needed to see her coming. The forest was green. Impossibly, relentlessly, overwhelmingly green. 6 years of painted trees had not prepared me for the actual color of chlorophyll in morning light. The canopy moved. Wind existed, and it touched my face, and it smelled like a world that was not mine. And I was shaking so hard, the hatch vibrated against its hinges. I heard running. Small, fast, purposeful. Through the trees, moving toward me. A shape, backlit by the morning. Too small and too fast to be anything but a child. June, June, you did it. You're here. Bee, 7 years old today. Running toward a hole in the ground where a woman stood on the 7th step with her hands white-knuckled on the rim, and her face wet, and her mouth trying to form a word, any word, and finding only the one that mattered. Happy birthday. She reached me. She took my hand. Her fingers were warm and small, and that they closed around mine with the grip of someone who had never doubted this moment would come. It's okay, she said. We don't have to go far. Just here, just this much. Just this much. Just the hatch, just the sky. Just the first 7 feet of a world I'd been listening to through a pipe for 3 years. And it was louder and brighter and wider than any mural could hold. And I was standing in it, and I had not come apart. I sat on the edge of the hatch with my legs dangling into the bunker and my face in open air. And B sat beside me and told me about the cake. And I listened, and the forest moved around us. And I didn't go further, and I didn't go back down. And the morning light was nice, just as Annika had said. Just exactly as nice as it deserved to be. I didn't walk to the camp that day. I sat at the hatch for 40 minutes, and then I went back down and closed it and lay on the cot and shook for 2 hours. But I opened it again the next morning, and the morning after that. Each day, a few more feet. Each day, the perimeter alarm a little quieter, not silent, never silent, but quieter. The way a smoke detector sounds different once you know the toast just burned and the house is not on fire. On the 11th day, I reached the camp. B held my hand the entire way. Annika had set a chair for me at the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line, where I could have the canopy partly overhead and the root back in sight. I sat in the chair. Kai brought me water. Thomas showed me the garden and didn't comment when I touched the soil and then couldn't stop touching it. I brought one notebook, Where the Wild Things Are. I read it to Bee and Kai and Bug, who did not understand a word, but sat in Annika's lap and stared at me with the round, uncomplicated attention of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the unfamiliar. I still sleep in the bunker. I go down every evening, and I come up every morning, and the 7 steps are the same steps they have always been. And I climb them. And the hatch opens. And the sky is there. And it hasn't killed me yet. The west wall still has my mother's hands. The map is still pinned beside them. But I've added something new, a drawing, done in paint water with a sharpened stick, in the crude and graceless hand of a woman who is relearning what it means to reach. It's a small figure standing at the top of 7 stairs, arms open, face tilted up. Doesn't look like me. Doesn't look like anyone. But every morning, I pass it on the way up. And every morning, it looks a little more possible.